And joining me later will be Katie from here at the zoo and Robin from Climate Outreach. So we're going to give you three probably quite different perspectives on this subject. So I think this is taboos and red herrings are something that sort of brought throughout the sector and can potentially be a big drain on our energy, resource and time, but maybe seen a different way could be an opportunity or something that we should be seeking to move through. So we'll take it in turns and present a provocation each about 10 minutes, and then there'll be time at the end, and we'll all be up on stage, and hopefully you'll have lots of challenging questions to ask us, and we'll have a good discussion. So I'm up first, and I should say I need to make my excuses first off. Here I'm going to talk about birds, but I'm not an ornithologist, and I was a bit reluctant to go and speak to my colleagues for coming to do this because, well, some of these things that we talk about aren't just taboos and red herrings externally in the outside world. They can also be a bit controversial within the organisation. So I want to see who I can enlist for help in case I get things wrong. I want to know, hands up if you know what this is. There's a few people. I'm sure there's probably other people who are not putting their hands up just because they're going to be called out. So, yeah, if you didn't guess that, it's a curlew. Curlews, ground nesting birds, long bills, well loved throughout the country. Does anybody know how well they're doing? Are they doing okay? Are they doing badly? Badly. That's right. So, a 65% decline since 1970. The UK is home to a quarter of the world's population. This is a species that really, its future in the UK really determines its future in the world. It's potentially, well, I suppose it's come to WWT, the organisation where I work, our attention, because it has a couple of things going for it in terms of species conservation. It is one, what we sort of term an umbrella species. If you can get things right in terms of habitat management and the conditions for curlews, it will help lots of other species, hopefully, other ground nesting waders. And secondly, it's kind of a flagship. People love curlews. That sound that you just heard is used. If you listen out for it, whenever you're watching TV and there's wilderness, that sound will be played in the background. It's like stock wilderness sound. Before we'd even started working on curlews, we did an appeal, and it was our most successful appeal ever. That just sort of shows the amount of love for curlews, and it's certainly something that we will play more on as we communicate the work that we're trying to do. But there's lots of other people working in curlew conservation already. So, as you can see, there's huge areas. These green areas are where they breed, and certainly they're concentrated in the upland areas in the north mostly. WWT doesn't really historically work in the uplands. We work in lowland, wet areas, and so it was these areas where there wasn't much curlew conservation happening already, where we decided to focus our work. So it was these green areas in southern Britain where we were working. As I say, there was a lot of people already working in curlew. So there's traditional conservation organisations probably represented here quite a lot, but because it's upland moorlands, it's also a lot of land management that's sort of more on the country sports shooting side of things. So it's quite a broad church. These are a spectrum of organisations that don't necessarily see eye to eye all the time, before getting into this, we were kind of mindful that there were pitfalls that we perhaps didn't want to get caught up in. Does anybody know what the threats are that curlews face? What's causing their decline? Go on then.
So habitat management is an issue in terms of upland and lowland breeding sites, and predation, often linked to margins of forestry, so higher predation rates. So keepering is quite a controversial area around curlew, but it's actually quite good for curlew.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. I'm glad you're in the audience. So yeah, land management. Farming practices have changed over the years. I don't think our farmland is a lot drier as well, but crops have been taken at different times, and so nesting birds are getting munched up by machinery. But predation is a massive issue. With predators comes the sort of slightly thorny issue of predator control. So this is our taboo subject when it comes to wildlife conservation. You have up in the uplands, keepering, where predators are kept under tight control because people want to rear game birds. Has yielded results in the uplands, and certainly if you read the shooting times, they'll say this is the answer to curlew conservation. But even among the sort of conservation forums that are trying to push forward curlew conservation, there is this recognition that if we don't address the fact that lots of curlew chicks and nests get munched before they get anywhere, we are not being honest with ourselves or the public about what the situation is. I believe Britain has twice the number of generalist predators of any other country in Europe, so that's foxes and crows and things like that. So it is something that internally, before we started doing this, there were lots and lots of conversations about. And I remember sitting there and our head of conservation science at the time saying to our head of marketing, we need to put this in our membership magazine. And the head of marketing going, no, we don't need to talk to our members about this, not at the moment. So this is the sort of taboo that we have. The solutions. So what we go and do to sort these problems out. There is one, working with farmers is a big bit of our work. I'm not going to talk about that so much today, but our objective. So working with farmers to help them understand where curlews are nesting, change their cropping practices so that they give curlews a chance to get off a clutch of chicks before mowing and stuff like that. But this isn't a curlew. Does anybody know what this chick is? A spoonbill sandpiper, that's right. So WWT has become known in certain circles for doing something called head starting, which is essentially taking eggs from nests in the wild, rearing them in captivity, looking after them until they're fledgling age and releasing them back into the wild. And it's been done quite successfully in Eastern Asia with spoonbill sandpipers. We've been doing it with black-tailed gobwits in East Anglia. And it is something that, it involves lots of cute-looking chicks like this, and it gets a lot of attention. And so there was a lot of groups already looking at curlew conservation in lowland Britain, where they were very keen to get involved with this. It yields results quite quickly. It's kind of sexy. The media love it. And this is our red herring because it's expensive. You can't do it forever. And it's not going to solve the problem on its own. It is also, in some circles, still slightly controversial. So, so these are our problems. We have a big taboo and a bit of a red herring. And what do we do about them? Well, the discussion, the solution we came up with was try and reframe the issue. Essentially, the underlying problem is that there are too many predators in the UK. Working out what happens, how that system works, and what we can do to change it is going to take a long, long time. So we're trying to look at a long-term project now to get to the bottom of this and see whether we can recommend solutions down the road. But in the meantime, we've got to stop being diverted by arguments about whether or not we should shoot or kill anything, and also not being too distracted by cute chicks. So rather than me continue to talk anymore, I'll try and show you a little video that was a go at trying to give a bigger picture of the situation, if this works. So This is something we made for social media, and hopefully frames the problem in that long time frame. To it upfront about predators, not shying away from it, but showing the long view of the situation. Showing that we're not just doing one thing. Sorry, leave that there. But there's a little overview of one of the things that we do that sort of encompasses those sort of challenges. And yeah, we've yet to know whether this approach will save us from getting too distracted by these things, but at the same time, sort of showing that, trying not to necessarily shy away from addressing these things, just thinking about how to frame the situation, how to frame the issue so that it doesn't just become a tit-for-tat argument. So now I'd like to invite Katie from the zoo up, who's going to talk to us about sustainable palm oil.
Okay, so hi all. I'm actually going to talk about the red herring, which is palm oil. So how many of you have seen articles like this in the news which say things really quite strongly like, is palm oil really that bad? Yes, here's what you can do about it. And what is palm oil? Where is it found? And how can you avoid it? Hands up if you've seen articles like this everywhere. Everybody's got their hand up. Brilliant. Okay, so hands up if you have decided to stop buying products because they contain palm oil after seeing articles like this in the media. Quite a few of you. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is give you a quick background on palm oil. So a few facts. Palm oil is actually the most produced vegetable oil in the world. We produce about 60 million tons of each year, and this demand is increasing. And it's an incredibly efficient crop. So to give you an idea, 1 hectare of oil palm plantation can produce about 4 to 6 times more oil than any other vegetable oil producing crop, which is amazing. Manufacturers actually want to choose palm oil. They want to use it. And the reason is, firstly, palm oil is incredibly versatile, okay? It can be a liquid, it can be a solid, it can be blended with other oils. There's a lot you can do with palm oil that you can't do with any other vegetable oils. It also has things like a natural preservative effect, which increases the shelf life of your product. And it's also odorless, so it has no smell, which is really important when you're thinking about what types of oils you would use in your products. And to give you an idea of where it comes from, the largest producer is Southeast Asia, so mainly Malaysia, Indonesia, but we're also seeing it being produced in countries in Africa, as well as places like Latin America. And the largest importers are India, China, and the EU. So together we import about 50% of all palm oil. The EU is about 11%, and I believe the UK at the moment is about 400,000 tons. So we're a very big stakeholder in the palm oil industry. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that the demand for palm oil has rapidly been increasing. And this means that we're seeing a lot of palm oil being produced unsustainably, which is causing a lot of environmental and social issues. And probably a lot of you, when you're thinking of palm oil, the first thing that will come into your mind is our friends the orangutan. Okay, some of you are nodding. So what do we do? How do we stop these environmental and social issues? Should we boycott palm oil? And this is a question that we have to ask ourselves because it's in the media, and the media are telling us to boycott it all the time. And the answer is no, we should not be boycotting palm oil. And you're probably thinking, well, why? Okay, so if we go back to how much palm oil we produce each year, like I said, we produce about 60 million tons of it. If collectively we decide to boycott, manufacturers will have to replace that oil with another vegetable oil. It might be soybean, it might be rapeseed. And you're probably thinking, well, why is that such a big issue? The reason it's a big issue goes back to how efficient oil palms are, okay? So to make this even clearer, of all the land used to produce vegetable oils in the world, palm oil uses about 6.6% of that land. And yet of all the vegetable oils produced each year, palm oil contributes 38.7%. So what this shows us is that we can produce a lot of palm oil on a small amount of land. And if we decide to boycott and another vegetable oil is used, we're probably going to need way more land to meet that demand. And we'll be simply just displacing all the environmental and social issues associated with the palm oil industry into another vegetable industry. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is that we need to support palm oil that is being sustainably produced. So why isn't it that easy? Why aren't we all doing this already? Okay? And it all comes back to, part of it is to do with the media. Everything we're seeing in the media all the time is telling us that all palm oil is bad and that we should boycott it. And, you know, just think back to last year. Think back to Christmas last year when Iceland went viral with their video, which was actually Greenpeace's video, telling you that you should be supporting a palm oil-free Christmas. Think how damaging big campaigns are like this to the sustainable palm oil industry. And in fact, there's this tweet here just to prove it. You know, this tweet by Iceland was retweeted over 91,000 times. It's incredibly hard for organizations who support sustainable palm oil to actually have their voice heard. And we've been trying. So here's a few tweets that we put out last year saying, actually, you know what, we don't agree with Iceland. We really should be supporting sustainable palm oil. And the backlash we got was quite big. So there's a tweet in the middle from us here at Bristol Zoo, and already a Miss Isabella Allen decided to say the slaughter of the orangutan now justifies sustainable palm oil plantations. Our friends at Chester Zoo tried to do the same. They were accused of actually just advertising palm oil, and we still get it now. So my colleague and myself, Grania, went out to Papua New Guinea. Grania put something on her Twitter feed about how we're going out to see sustainable oil palm plantations, and straight away she had a comment underneath saying, and whilst you're there, why don't you check out all the deforestation? It makes it so tricky for us to talk about sustainable palm oil, because as soon as we do, people say we are being greenwashed. So what do? Okay? We know what we should be doing, okay? The first thing is that we need to talk more and much louder about sustainable palm oil. And we really need to differentiate between sustainable and unsustainable palm oil, okay? Yes, let's keep talking about the negative social environmental impacts of unsustainable palm oil, but let's make sure we're saying what sustainable palm oil is and actually all the benefits of sustainable palm oil and how these two things are actually very, very different. We need to have a clear, consistent message. And this actually links to my next point, which is collaboration. We have to team up with other organizations who are supporting sustainable palm oil, make sure we work together and make sure that we're putting out that clear, consistent message, which is easy for people to understand. You can't blame people for wanting to boycott palm oil because it's such an easy action to do. And unfortunately, the media has kind of made it into this big mess and made it seem like this massive demon that it makes it really hard to be able to talk about. But we also need to be supportive. There are a lot of organizations out there who are trying really, really hard to turn this around and support sustainable palm oil and make sure that we're only producing palm oil sustainably. We need to be supportive of them. Yes, criticize. Yes, be skeptical. Yes, help organizations become stronger. But be supportive that they are really trying to do their best. And be positive. And this is something we never see in the palm oil industry. Okay? It's always doom and gloom. We need to be positive about sustainable palm oil and positive about the benefits it can have. So we know what to do. How do we do it? And this really is the big question that we are stuck on in the sustainable palm oil world. How do we do it? And the reason this is really tricky for us is because, like I said just now, we can't get our voices heard, okay? If you think of the boycotting messages, they're always louder than us. It's so hard to compete against that. But actually what we need to do is we need to team up with organizations and we need to use mediums which are really influential and engage thousands of people. And I'm going to give you one example of how we've tried to do that recently. And this is the new 7 World series. Has anybody been watching it? Yeah, I'm getting quite a lot of nods. Did anybody watch the Asia episode 2 weeks ago? Fabulous. At the end of the Asia episode, there was a lovely, clear message on how we should support sustainable palm oil, which we deliberately included in there, okay? And a series like this is incredibly influential, and probably one of the main reasons is our friend Dave. And this tweet just summed it up perfectly. Someone just put hashtag I believe David Attenborough. And that is the influence that people like David Attenborough can have, especially on a really complex topic like palm oil, which is very, very emotional. So what was happening in response to this series? Actually, if you were going online where people like to really air their voices, there was a lot of positive happening. People were putting on Twitter and on social media how actually they were labeling companies saying, you're not using sustainable palm oil, why aren't you? You should be. We were seeing people say to Cadbury's, come on Cadbury's, make sure your palm oil is sustainable. We had people going on about the supermarket saying, come on, start labeling, start telling us about the sustainable palm oil you're using. We had zoos globally get together, write a statement about how we support sustainable palm oil, and collectively start shouting about it. You know, we even had Seven Worlds put their own article up about palm oil and how, you know, they went through the process of learning about sustainable palm oil and how they now support it. You know, and I'm not naive. This isn't, you know, this doesn't mean that we've sorted the sustainable palm oil issue out. This doesn't mean that everybody is now using it. It doesn't mean that these people who went on Twitter are making sure that they're only buying products with sustainable palm oil. But actually, it's a really good step in the right direction, and this is the type of media attention that we need. And I wanted to end on a bit of a positive, which was this. My colleague sent me an email, and she said, we caught up on the new David Attenborough programme last night, which was on Asia, and saw the devastation the palm oil plantations have done to Borneo. After we finished watching it, my son wanted to go through the cupboard to see if everything we buy contains sustainable palm oil. And this gives me hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katie. And now I'd like to invite Robin from Climate Outreach to come up and take the stage.
Hello. I'm working. Guess I think I'm working. Oh, I'm not working. Sorry, hang on. There. Okay, using that one. Okay, I have to push it quite hard apparently. Hello, hi. I work for Climate Outreach, which is a little charity based in Oxford. We work on the social science of climate change communications. So essentially our job is to think about how different people talk about climate change in different communities to try and kind of break out of talking about climate change to just a small community of people that think share similar political views, and also to sort of create a bridge in between the research into the social science of climate change communications and the people out there doing the practice. And what we do is we provide both advice and training, so we do research ourselves, and we also work with organisations, training them and working on a consultancy model. And we want to sort of work from both the kind of, it's like from Extinction Rebellion up to the World Bank, so basically with as wide a group as possible. And as well as there's 20 years of research out there, or 30 even, on the social science of climate change communications. But essentially so much of our work comes back to that thing that activists often find difficult, which is sitting down in rooms and listening to people talk and working out where they're coming from, what their values are, what they care about, and how we can use that as a way of thinking about climate change. One thing, just getting into this topic, I want to think about what's changing with people's perceptions of climate change, and therefore some of the kind of debates and concerns that are out there in terms of thinking about both the taboos and the red herrings in the climate change debate. Now, what's going on with climate change communications is I keep having to change my slides because it's changing so fast. We've had a real sea change that's taken place, both with some of these massive protest movements that have risen up with the climate strikes, with the rise of Extinction Rebellion. And then in the wake of the Extinction Rebellion protests in April, quite a few polls started coming out, polls that really made sort of climate change communicators step back and go, wow, we didn't actually know this was happening. So this figure of 52% of British adults saying they're very concerned about climate change. The previous high was 30%, and that was back in 2008 when we were working towards the Copenhagen conference, when there was another kind of bump. But we're in the middle of a more coherent, a higher, a more consistent bump at the moment. 61%, and some other polls have put it at more like 2/3 of people saying they support the idea that we're in the middle of a climate emergency. And this figure at the moment saying the proportion of people putting the environment in the top 3 issues facing the country has tripled in the last 2 years. And one reason why that's important, I'll explore that in a minute, but it's the difference between if I went to you and said, are you worried about climate change? And you said, yes. And if I said to you, what are you worried about? Because what we've seen in the past is if we say, what are you worried about? People say virtually everything else apart from climate change. They say the economy, they say immigration, they say health, they say education. But now we're starting to see the environment being an issue that people are actually spontaneously talking about. And that's a real shift. So this issue of like saying climate change is going to have an impact on my life. What I want to the point I really want to make with this slide is this is not just happening in the UK. A lot of research that's into climate change communications is based in the UK and America. So that's where we have a lot of our knowledge base. But this is meant to represent Italy. 82% of people in one said that climate change will have a great deal or a fair impact of my life. 94% of people in Vietnam in a recent survey. So it's very high levels of concern. But, as I said, that recent question of if you actually say to people, what are you worried about, do they actually start talking about climate change? The reason I've got a picture of a spinach tart there is from an anecdote which has come from a few years back. When you're all kind of sitting around at a dinner table and you sort of start chatting and you raise climate change, or perhaps you raise an issue about whether someone's flying on holiday or something to do with emissions, and then there's a little silence and someone says, lovely spinach tart. And you all start talking about something else. And we labelled this idea climate silence. In other words, that there were very high level and increasing levels of concern in our society about climate change, but somehow we weren't talking about it. And there are figures that back this up. So figures in the States saying that up to sort of 60% of people saying they virtually never talk about climate change in their daily lives and the people around them. I should add, I'm putting this as my first taboo. I think it's a social taboo. We've had a social taboo around talking about climate change. And for various reasons, we found it really difficult to have that conversation. We did a survey over the summer where we asked people about their views on having conversations about climate change in their daily lives. And we asked them, why do you find it hard? And this survey ended up covering about 550 people from 56 different countries. And I was actually really surprised and really interested to see that the top reason why they said, I find it hard to have this conversation is I don't know what to do about it. And I think that's quite in context of some of the conversations we're having over these 2 days. I think that's really interesting because you might say, why don't you know what to do about it? There are like 1,000 things on the internet telling you what to do about it or giving you advice, but it's that feeling of kind of, is it enough? Is it the right thing that I can do about it? What's the path that I can take? Is it something which is actually reflective of the level of the challenge that we're thinking about? So we've sort of had a social agreement not to have the conversation, partly, I think, as a result of some of these issues, it feeling overwhelmed, people feeling guilty, not feeling really like it's our problem, that it's something that's to do with kind of polar bears on the other side of the world, something that will happen in 2050, not really being sure that the person you're talking to is actually worried about climate change, and not knowing enough about it. All of these issues have been kind of creating this pattern that actually, I'd be really interested to see a survey on climate silence and how much that has changed over the last year. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like this taboo is kind of being broken at the moment. Actually, yeah, seeing as you're here, no, you're the wrong people to ask. I don't know. Tell me, can you put your hand up if you've had a conversation about climate change in your personal life and not in your working life in the last week? See, it's totally changing. And I have these conversations with my sister-in-law now. It's amazing. So, how are we having these conversations, and are we still finding them difficult? So I want to kind of dive into a few of the kind of taboos that make it difficult for us to talk about climate change and that we're still struggling. This is a Extinction Rebellion sign, which I've edited to make it polite. And the first time this is a tagline of Extinction Rebellion. It's something that they say. I remember about a year ago, before Extinction Rebellion became such a massive thing, there was a sort of something on the media, somebody was basically shouting this on the streets of Oxford. And one of my colleagues said, I did not work for 15 years on climate change communications for this. We've had a real understanding for quite a long time around the social science that people are really overwhelmed by very negative information. and that we need to have some kind of sense of hope, some kind of sense of community, something to engage with in order to do something with climate change. And if you're just bombarded with negative facts and figures, then it's overwhelming and it's frightening. But then people have looked at this and said, well, Extinction Rebellion's messaging is extremely negative, extremely frightening. How is it that that's to some extent connecting with people? And I think what we've done is we've kind of forgotten the second half of that message, which actually shows us that if you pair this kind of very negative information with some sense that there's something that we can do as people, kind of twinning it with somewhere positive to take it, and that, in some sense, that's kind of a feeling that something is kind of authentic. It's not contrived, that we're speaking from an authentic place ourselves, and that we have a sense of efficacy. In other words, that we have a sense that we can do something ourselves. That's when this kind of very negative messaging can kind of go somewhere. And I think the people that have started to kind of participate in these protest movements have been able to kind of do that, to kind of do something with those kind of very negative emotions. And I think that's one reason why we're seeing this kind of connecting right now. How long have I got? I feel like I think these are the biggest taboos, perhaps in our daily life, conversations about flying, conversations about food. Like I remember a kind of conversation with a friend a few years ago when she said, I'm flying to France. And I sort of just went, you're flying to France? With that kind of intonation. And she talked at me for about half an hour, explaining to me why she had to fly to France. And I think this sense of these are the really difficult conversations for us to have. And I think it's interesting to point out that actually the polls show that in principle, we're pro doing something about these complicated issues. 2/3 of people saying they agree we should limit air travel, nearly as much saying that they'd be willing to eat less red meat. But there are kind of limitations to that. When it gets to the questions, how far would I go? Nearly 60% of people saying they wouldn't be willing to go vegetarian, or they wouldn't be willing to stop eating meat. And this was in another survey. 40% of people, when asked, are you doing enough to tackle climate change, said, I'm doing as much as I reasonably can. And I think that kind of shows the limitations of this kind of increase in concern when we get to these kind of more identity-based issues. And I think one of these reasons why is because the actions that we take in our daily lives, particularly what we eat, it's so kind of fundamental to our sense of identity, where we're coming from, who we are. And if I say to you, I think the things you eat are wrong, that's a kind of an attack on your choices, an attack on who you are. And I think that's one reason why we see those kind of very kind of integral issues around where we go on holiday, like what we eat, as being something that people find really difficult to sort of cope with, because it's a kind of direct attack on the choices we're making. I drew this graph the other day. I don't know if it's going to work, but there's a real massive debate at the moment in the climate change world as to this question of, is it a red herring to talk about lifestyle change? If we try and think about trying to persuade you not to have a steak when you go home for dinner, does that matter? And I think part of the concern this has come from a kind of wave in the 1990s, when there were a lot of those kind of 10 tips, 10 things you can do, 10 things you can buy to reduce your emissions, all that, which is kind of very neoliberal, really, kind of very individualistic, like not being a part of a community. And what it misses out is that the choices you make as an individual, if we then go and share those with other people, talk to other people, that we as people are very fundamentally and profoundly influenced by the behaviour of our peers, by the behaviour of the people around us. We're not as rational as we think we are. We're not so as rational that we're sort of influenced so much by numbers and facts and figures that we're told, or how expensive something is. We're influenced by people. We're influenced by what we hear. So when you see that changing of social norms, see that changing of what we see the people around us doing and saying, and we've seen these other social changes, like smoking is a sort of massive one. We saw a shift on social norms. Then you're moving towards this point of political change. And I want to be kind of really hesitant about this, because obviously we're also looking towards our political leaders to take action on climate change, to be the leaders, but actually they are also looking to society to give them consent, to say, actually, okay, if we do radical policy change, and if you think about what we need to do on climate change and how quick it has to be, it really is radical. Governments are never going to do that if they don't feel that they've got the social support. And I'm just going to finish with, well, the most impossible one. There's this idea, climate change is system change. Whatever your political background or perspective, I think a lot of us would agree that the climate change poses a fairly fundamental challenge to the society in which we live and to the models and on which it's built. And that does pose quite a significant taboo/social problem, in that one thing that we see as communicators is the way that we talk about climate change. When you talk about kind of like phrases like the Green Revolution, talk about capitalism being the problem, that this is a conversation which is very powerful and compelling to people of a certain political persuasion, to the people who are from the left-hand side of the political spectrum. If you're more conservative political spectrum, then those kind of languages and messages are profoundly threatening and make it more likely that you're not going to want to engage with this conversation. So I consider that to be quite a problem in a sense, because there are some things that are extremely hard to say, essentially, across society. I think probably everyone. That's it.
Well, thank you both for the interesting presentations. Before we open it up to the floor, we're all from quite different organisations. Do you think that as environmental organisations, we should be deliberately setting out to challenge taboos? It's quite a brave move from the zoo world to take on this issue and confront it head on. Obviously, in climate, there's lots of taboos that we can break. Is this a tactic that we should be taking?
Yes. I mean, I do think there's one reason that I've found, for all its goods and bads, Extinction Rebellion's messaging powerful, is that thing of tell the truth. I think that's really resonated with people, and it's got that real moral call, and it resonates across the political spectrum. And when we're dealing with the kind of profound social changes that we're looking at, essentially when you're looking at the kind of pressure there is upon scientists to try and communicate something which is profoundly frightening, really, then we can't really be dealing with taboos. But you have to do it in an intelligent way. And I think that's a lot of what communications is about thinking, how can we say the same thing, but how can we say it in a way which isn't going to kind of accidentally really, really annoy this half of the population that I just didn't happen to think about when I was making my messaging up. So it's kind of breaking the taboos, but being clever.
Is it also a case of timing, do you think? Now, we've seen several times during the day it come up, the sort of peaks in concern about climate change. Do you think there is a sort of, things come at the right time element to this?
Yeah.
There is
there's been a certain amount of kind of muttering, I think, from people who've worked in grassroots activism and non-violent direct action, who were going, well, we tried to do that 10 years ago, not paying any attention, it's not fair. And it's like, I think the recent wave has tapped into something that actually we had almost been underestimating as professionals, that there is this bubbling under level of concern that has been kind of growing bit by bit, and suddenly we found a way of saying it.
Yeah. And from the zoo world, I mean, it does seem like a brave move from the zoo world to take on, not, sustainable palm oil when it was, it was orangutans and it was a dirty word, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, what is the feeling across the zoo world about whether this was a wise fight or a...
It's absolutely a wise fight.
Yeah.
I mean, just because something is tricky doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. And I know, bless them, I know our marketing team are very, very nervous about our palm oil work, and as they should be, rightly so, because they're the ones that have to deal with the backlash when we get comments on social media saying, oh, so it's okay to kill all the orangutans. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle it. And I agree with what you're saying. We need to tackle it in an intelligent way. And these issues are so complicated. And I think we have to understand that. And it can be really frustrating, I think, for us being sat there going, why don't you understand? But we have to understand why people don't understand and try and make that easier for them. But something like palm oil is so tricky because it's so emotional. And as soon as orangutans are mentioned, it's like you've lost everyone, It's very, very hard.
I hadn't seen the Seven Worlds episode, and
You need to.
I will do. I'll go back and watch it. So you can go and you can scan the stuff in your house with an app, can you?
There are tools out there if you want to do that. But I mean, the great thing about the Seven Worlds episode is that actually, so Emma, who produced the show, made quite a strong stance that she wanted to be able to give people an action. You know, I can't speak on her behalf. This was absolutely her baby. And actually, when she came and had a chat with me and said, I want to talk about sustainable palm oil, what do you think? I was like, that is such a brilliant tool to use, because people find those programs so engaging. And like having David Attenborough actually say to people, you know what, do you support sustainable palm oil? Hopefully will make a huge difference. And then the great thing also that I think that they did is that they put a lot of information on their website. So, you know, there are resources that you can use, and it was really great for them to say, well, hang on, you know, you can download Geeky Badges, you can use an app that will tell you what has sustainable palm oil in it, which is great, because that's what people need. You don't want to watch a program and go, oh gosh, that was really sad, what can I do? Or they've given me no direction. It was actually really great that we gave direction in that show.
Great. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to comment or question? So Mike over there,